I work on the ancient democracy at Athens, the system of self-government that was devised in the early 5th century BC, especially the 400s, and continued on down into the 300s. This was the same culture that more or less invented drama, as we still traditionally think of it, tragedy and comedy. And those really influential genres are very much affected by the kind of democratic procedures that I work on. I focus on the intersection of law and rhetoric, which is to say the inscribed rules of the ancient democracy, and the system of reasoning that developed from it. In other words, what we call rhetoric is really sort of an art of argument, the way you persuade the other side to come to the right decision. And the material I work with is something that many of the audience might find surprising. We do, of course, have inscribed records. We have stone inscriptions of many of the ancient laws, but we also have quite a corpus of speeches written for politicians and prosecutors to deliver. In fact, this ancient democracy, for better or worse, also invented speech writing. So that's a really interesting body of material. It not only gives us a lot of evidence about what the laws were and what the rules governing the democracy really boiled down to, it tells us the kinds of assumptions and values ordinary Athenian citizens brought to these issues. I started out working on the homicide law, which supposedly goes back to the ancient lawgiver Draco in the 620s BC. That system of law was carried on down to the very end of the democracy 300 years later. It was treated with great respect, even though for long periods it looks as though they probably didn't have that many trials that were governed by those rules anymore. But that way of dealing with homicide trials inspired a whole genre of speeches about how do you handle this kind of argument. That's what my first book was about. In homicide in the ancient world, as you may know, there's the idea that a kind of physical contagion or pollution attaches to the killer. And one of the concerns is that the killer will bring that pollution wherever he goes and bring disaster on the community that takes him in. So there's a powerful incentive for the community at large to send that killer out, to demand that he have purification in some form and that he reconcile with the family of his victim before he tries to come back. So a lot of the procedural rules revolve around that, and we find that concern for the community reflected in those terms. The really abiding fascination I have with this material, and that is what you might call generally cultural difference. The fact that we turn back to this material and we like to assume that our own values and assumptions will apply, but if we look closely we find there's a whole different fabric of assumptions woven into the way they made their laws and carried out their arguments. It looks like a criminal prosecution, but when you look more deeply, it's this web of religious implications and fairly mercenary considerations that reflect a profoundly religious concern with the way the crime might affect the community. I've just finished a book about the civil war at Athens, the amnesty agreement that put an end to that conflict, and the way the Athenians began to rebuild their legal system in the time of Plato, the 300s BC. After a brief but bloody civil war in which much of the old legal system had been dismantled, the Athenians found they had to rebuild a lot of things and be really specific about what sorts of rights and obligations carried over from the old regime to the new. For instance, they were very clear that any of your financial obligations in private dealings among citizens carried over. For instance, if you had a rental arrangement, somebody leasing your property back in the old democracy 10, 15 years earlier, those obligations were unaffected. You couldn't duck out on it just because a war had intervened. But any of the criminal prosecutions, what we would call criminal prosecution, going back before the Civil War, those were essentially wiped clear. You couldn't prosecute anybody using the current criminal prosecution laws for wrongs committed back before 403, the year of the amnesty. Now, from that project, I'm moving on to another study that involves a similar comparative perspective. In the book on Athenian amnesty, I tried to make reference regularly to the modern perspective, the way amnesty has evolved and become such an important idea in the modern world. The recent death of Nelson Mandela drives home how powerful a force for reconciliation can be in the world. And I make some reference to the South African example in that book. With a similar comparative perspective, I'd like to study, I've begun to study Athenian constitutionalism, the ancient model for the idea that the sovereign power within a community, whether it's a king or a court of the people or a tyrant, that sovereign body is subject to some higher law. That basic principle can follow in many directions. I'm looking at the way the Athenians came up with their version of that idea and how it really differs from our own approach to constitutionalism.